Welcome to this lesson at the Polgar Chess University. Our theme today is talking about what is space advantage in chess. Also, we'll learn about some basic pawn endgames and the opposition as well as distant opposition. And we'll see a miracle on the chessboard. Well, the first position we see is actually taken from a very famous game by former world champion, the Cuban Jose Raul Capablanca, who actually has been world champion for many, many years. And his opponent in this game was Karel Treibal. And the game is being played in 1929. But let's talk about the position itself. What is space advantage? Typically, we talk about space advantage when at least one of our pawns is more advanced than our opponent. Like in this case, it's quite clear that white's c-pawn is more advanced than black's c6 pawn. It's the dominant one. Or white's b-pawn is more advanced, obviously, than black's pawn that's still on b7. As you can see, the d-pawn, for example, are even-steven, right, with the black pawn. Or so is the white f4 pawn with the black f5 pawn. They are on even terms. But when a pawn like the one on c4 is pressuring a pawn on d5, and its counterpart from c6 is the defendant one, that is usually when we talk about space advantage or some type of more activity or better position. Now here, in addition to what we already talked about, the space advantage, it's also quite clear that white's bishop is better than black's. Why is that? It is because you can see quite amazingly all this pawn chain of blacks, all of the black pawns are on the same scalar square. And the problem is not that they are on the same colors. The problem is that they are on the same color with black's bishop. And therefore, greatly limiting the black's bishop's mobility. Another important tip about such closed type of position: when one side has space advantage, typically the less pieces there are, the more room there would be to maneuver for the remaining pieces. So therefore this trade would be an inaccuracy from white's side. Therefore, white continued in this position by playing knight to f3. That's what happened in the actual game, to keep the pieces on the board so they kind of bother each other. Sadly for black pretty much has to take a waiting strategy, as black hardly has any active plan. And white played c5. This further closes the position and gains space, or in other words, takes space away from black's pieces. If we just kind of want to look at it brute force and look exactly which squares this last move took away from black, we'll notice that the b6 square and the d6 square are no longer available for the black pieces, because if they would move there, they would get captured. Black continued with knight f6. Now the next step is in such and similar situations when one side has space advantage that eventually they'll need to look for ways to open up one file through which the white rooks or queen or sometimes other pieces can come in to attack black's weak squares or weak pieces. However, it should be white to decide when is the right moment to open up the position, while all their pieces are ideally located. In the meantime, white continued with a4, preparing when the moment will be right to play b5. But in the meantime, as we'll see, there's no rush. This is quite a long game. Now you may wonder, why didn't black move the knight to e4 in this position? Well, in that case, white would be more than happy to trade the bishop for the knight. By the way, remember, typically in closed type of positions, and when I mean closed, that there are no open files, and this is a very typical and good example of that, meaning that pawns like this that cannot move. And then when the pawn takes back, the white knight would have a fantastic outpost on e5 that can by no way be chased out of there. So black played knight to g4 in the game, and white continued with queen e1. The only thing white had to be careful about in this case, making sure the queen moved to a square from which it still protects the e3 pawn. And black is just kind of moving around and perhaps trying to get the knight to f7 so they can trade maybe for white's knight when it would arrive on e5. And now white decided to try to open the position on another flank as well. h3, knight f7, and g4. Normally, in open positions, we do not recommend move a pawn, a g-pawn, in front of our king's castled position. This is different for several reasons, mostly because the position is very closed and black has no way in getting anywhere close near the white king. Besides that, the way the pieces are positioned, white can easily swing over a rook, not only to protect his own king, but also at the same time to pressure, attack black's king. Black continued with another waiting move, bishop d7, and white played rook to c2, with the idea to get the rook to g2. Black is preparing, already getting out of the potential threat of white's rook. Black is preparing, so after a potential trade, black is ready for the opening of the g file. White, of course, did not trade, but in fact gained more space by closing the position with g5. Black is waiting, and white is looking for another avenue to cause trouble for black on the h file this time. Black is running away from trouble's way and came h5. This is very typical that white would temporarily sacrifice a pawn. White does not need to worry about black capturing that pawn because could win it back very, very quick after, for example, queen h4. And king g6, rook h2, of course, would not look nice for black. Let's get back to the actual game. After h5, black did not capture a pawn, but played rook to h8, waiting, hoping that white would capture, and then the black rook would be ideally positioned on the h file. But white does not do that favor to his opponent and played rook to h2. And again, black can only sit and wait. And now a number of waiting, preparing moves. And now white is preparing for the h file. Black is preparing too. some maneuvering moves. Sometimes these moves are only made to upset our opponent psychologically. Sometimes to get closer to a time control, like in time controls when you have to make, let's say, 40 moves in a certain amount of time. And now the moment became ripe. The moment is ready because of some tactical opportunities. And you'll see this so often that while all these strategical ideas come about, actually a tactical idea decides the game. Game b5, which is a temporary pawn sacrifice. And now white is ready to play h6. You can see how unfortunate the two black rooks are at the moment on h8 and g8, being stuck because the king is in their way. And also, just as importantly, after white took the pawn on b5, here is the tactic I was talking about, I was referring to, that now if the black pawn captures the b5 pawn, then all of a sudden there is a discovered check by this pawn advancing to c6, and then pawn captures bishop. Black did not capture the pawn on b5, but moved the king to e7, and now b6, before any of the black rooks would appear on the only open file in the position on a8. Now, it's not possible for black to do that, not because white would capture the queen, in which case black would be just fine, but after rook a8, the correct move is queen takes rook, winning a rook. So black made the natural move, moving the queen away from the attack. And now, of course, white is ready to refocus on the only open file. The rooks have nothing else to do on the h file, and came rook a1. Now white is preparing to triple there, but usually it's best not to have the queen in front. Usually you would want to have the queen behind, or at least in between the two rooks. And that's what white is about to do. And here comes the second rook. And the tripling has been accomplished in an ideal form, with the queen being behind the two rooks. Now the only challenge is how to break through. Of course, white cannot just play rook a8, because the black queen would capture. Rook captures, and black would be doing just fine, winning two rooks for in exchange for a queen. So that's not something black would need to be afraid of. Now white made a couple of more moves to put the king in a more ideal position, avoid any possible trick. For example, after the knight moves, maybe black would have an opportunity for some complications by sacrificing the knight and then reviving his queen, even though it's probably not that great for black, but it gives some unnecessary counter chance. So what white did, put the king in a better position, making some moves, kind of waiting moves. And finally the king found its ideal position, making sure under no circumstances will the black queen have any chances to get into white's territory here. And now time to optimize the white's knight position, and that is on a5. Now that you know where the knight needs to go in order to attack the pawn on b7, which is the base of this pawn chain, the next move is very understandable and logical. The knight is going on its route to b3 and a5. Continued, bishop d7, black is helpless, rook e8, knight a5 attacking the pawn on b7. Black's only way to defend is playing knight to d8. And now, as so often, a nice little tactic towards the end of the game to transform strategical advantage to material advantage by playing bishop a6. What a beautiful move, putting white's fifth piece on the a file, and of course, more importantly, attacking black's b7 pawn a third time. But what happens if black captures? Well, he did, but then black's bishop on d7 was unprotected. Now the pawn is under attack on h7. Black responded by playing rook to e7, and another little cute tactic, winning another pawn. Rook takes d8 check, rook takes, and here is a nice family fork attacking black's queen and two rooks. After queen moves away, white will capture one of the rooks, followed by the pawn on a6, and it's quite clear that these two pawns will be future queens. Well, this is a very, very famous and instructive game by Capablanca. Learning from this example and some others, I had the opportunity to use what I learned in a game that I played in the World Junior Championship in Australia in 1988 against the then Soviet representative Gregory Serper. And that's our next example. I reached this position after just 18 moves, and I had the white pieces. As you'll see, my first decision in this position was, kind of learning from Capablanca, to close the position and gain further space advantage, using the momentum that the black knight cannot centralize itself by moving to e4, because I would simply win a pawn by capturing. And also, the black knight could not go to f5, because then it would move into a fork. So the knight had to go backwards. And it did. And now, again, similarly to Capablanca's game, I played g4, because I understood that the black pieces are too passive to create any danger for my own king. Again, it's very important to notice that just like in the previous example, there are no open files or no opportunity for black to trade any pawns to create any open files. And now it's time to optimize the position of my pieces. Starting with the worst position piece, my knight on f1, I played knight h2, game f6, with some hopes and dreams to open the position with e5, but my next move takes further control of that key central square. Game rook e7, rook f1, and just like in the Capablanca game, I played b4, trying to open the position under my terms and in my time when I'll be ready for it. In the meantime, my opponent tries to prevent it, played a6, and I moved my queen to h2, getting it to a more optimal place for my kingside attack. Game knight e8, rook ad1, just in case an e5 move comes about. The beauty in such position is that the side that has more space to maneuver their pieces pretty much can move back and forth the pieces without any real loss, and kind of use the optimal moment where all the pieces are ready for the opening of the position. h4. Well, if my opponent would be just kind of make waiting moves, I would play h5 next. Passively walk my king away to the king side to get my rooks in a full swing attack against black's king. I can afford to do that because of the closed pawn structure on the other side and in the middle of the board. My opponent played f5 in this position in hopes that I would capture on f5. But no, I want to open the position under my terms and played g5. Can you see the similarities with the Capablanca game? It's exactly the same pawn structure. Well, my opponent didn't want to wait to see until I play h5 and pretty much end the game in a similar way as Capablanca did against Tribal, and decided to play h5 himself. And here I felt that the opportunity is right to open the position on the king side, and I did en passant. Bishop captured back and immediately h5. Even though my king is also on the g file that's potentially about to open, but my rooks are right there after king f2, ready to come to the attack. My opponent played rook g7, and of course king needs to move out of the rook's way. Pawn took on h5, queen took on h5, attacking black's bishop on h6. Black protected his bishop, and now time to centralize the knight on e5. The knight is beautiful on e5. Black brought the knight, and of course the rook needs to come to g1. Knight e8, coming to the defense of the king. And now an idea I really like, to utilize my bishop on b2 that seems to be kind of out of play because of all these pawns being on dark squares. But in this case I can make good use of it by playing bishop to c3. I traded rooks. Bring the rook to g1, second rook to g1. The idea is, of course, at the right moment to get my bishop to h4, although in the actual game, there was no need for it because I got material gain before that was needed. My opponent played queen to e8. And now came queen g5, which is quite a devastating move for black. It of course has the simple threat to capture black's bishop with a checkmate. If the rook moves to f7, the white knight can capture it. If the black queen moves to f8, protecting the bishop, then I can simply give a fork and win black's rook. And my opponent played rook f7, protecting the bishop. And here, actually, even better than taking the rook, a cute final move, bishop to e2, with the idea on the next move to play bishop to h5. And attack a rook a second time, not even giving up the knight for the rook. and my opponent resigned because he understood that there is no escape from major loss of material. Well, I encourage you to look at these games again or listen to the lesson again and try to remember the important points of these examples. The space advantage. Typically, try to avoid exchange of pieces when you have the space advantage, and if you're on the defensive side with less space than your opponent, then typically trades of equal value pieces are to your favor. Let's change the subject and look at some endgames, some pawn endgames, and talk about opposition and distant opposition. This is our first example. When it's white to move in this position. Well, the first move is quite obvious. White can go on either side of the pawn to accomplish its goal, king d2. Now, if king d7, king d3, king e4, king e6, king e4, and white accomplishes their goal to be on the side of the pawn and help the pawn march down. King e7, and now a tricky moment, not to rush by playing e4 because then the game is a draw after king f7. For example, e5, king e7, e6, and now the key move, king e8. And when the king moves on the 6th rank next to the pawn, only then king f8, e7, king e8, and now king e6 would result in stalemate. So that certainly would be a mistake. Therefore, instead of e4, white should be playing king e5. And after king f7, again, move forward, king d6. And now the path is clear. The pawn can simply march up. Not quite at this moment. Again, it's important to avoid this type of stalemate ending. Right? We want to avoid this. So what white needs to do here after king e8, again, get the opposition, force the black king to go to one side or another, and then the king from the side can support the white's pawn advancement to promotion. Again, let's go back. After king d2, black's trickiest response is to keep the distant opposition by playing king d8. And after king d3, king d7. King e4, king e6. Sadly for black though, white now has a quiet waiting move, e3, forcing the black king to give up the opposition. Opposition is a situation when the two kings are on the same file and there are odd number of squares in between them. In regular opposition, it's one square in between the two kings, or in distant opposition, it could be 3 or 5 squares. They are also always on the same color squares when we are talking about opposition. And now, white, similarly to the other variation, accomplishes its goal and wins the game. And the final duel, a beautiful position I'd like to share with you. This position, white to move and win. I suggest you pause this position and try to figure out how should white win here. Well, if you're not quite sure, I have a hint for you. It's not capturing the rook, because in that case, black would be still in the game, having several pawns in addition to the bishop, against white's rook. And in fact, probably black would not lose the game, but the game would end in a draw. The solution is quite brilliant. Keep threatening checkmate on d5 to start with, when black's only way to prevent that is to play c6. And now a brilliant series of sacrifices by rook d5, pawn takes, knight check, forcing black to take, and the little pawn becomes the hero. Checkmate. Well, I hope you learned, you had fun, and we'll be back next week. So long until then.